do any music. I love it when you come on here and you have no idea what we're doing. You have no idea. You don't know, right? You have no idea. I know. You've been here. I need to apologize to you publicly, to everybody else. Somehow our times got messed up and you were here an hour before you were supposed to be. And I'm sorry. I'll take full blame for that. I don't know how that happened, but it will not happen again. I do not want to waste an hour of your time when I could be talking to you. I do not like that. But what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to look at the last time we did a Civic Covenanting, because I want to consider this our Civic Covenanting reboot. And I'm looking, do you have a date on that? Because I'm looking right now, and I think, April 9th is my.
Wow.
Is that when it was?
It's been a while.
Wow, David. Didn't like me very much, huh?
It was exactly right. I was just like, I don't want to talk to this guy anymore.
Wow. You left me. Yeah, I think I'm looking at the dates. So right now, if you haven't been listening or paying attention to what David Reece and myself have been talking about, all Civic Covenanting, we don't even call it Christian nationalism. We're talking about something else. It's around the same topic. And I believe it last year we started going through, I started doing Knox Unleashed, and we started talking about the family on Fridays. And that morphed into a whole nother conversation about Civic Covenanting, which really family is the core, the beginning foundations of all of this. And we started turning Family Fridays into a series on Civic Covenanting that is really a rich and deep series. If you want to go check it out, go to YouTube. Under Cross Politics YouTube page, you can see a playlist called Civic Covenanting, and there's 14, it should be more. I think they're getting the audio versions up, but there's 14 episodes there. There's probably, what you say, David, 2 more that we did that are not here.
Yeah, because the very first one we were engaging with Stephen Wolf's book when it first came out with
right.
Christian nationalism, and we were just kind of talking about Christian nationalism as an idea and different possible interpretations of it, having read the book, and we were talking about it. And then we also contrasted that with and compared it with civil covenanting in terms of the historical act of like the covenanters or reformed people forming Christian covenants for a civil sphere. And so that was the kind of thing that we initiated the conversation.
That's
right. We went in from there. And then I think by episode 3, we were doing video.
Yeah, I was trying to get you to do video the first time. It's like, let's just do video. But I don't think you were set up for a studio then, but now you are. So I want to do a reboot of that Civic Covenanting today. But you should be very, very nervous right now, David.
I'm always nervous.
You have no idea what we're going to talk about. We're talking about the Trinity, David. We're not talking about the Trinity. Y'all can find that conversation on X. But here's what I want to talk to you about, because I was just telling you, I was listening. We had some stories that we did on Cross Politic from 2024, the most important stories that we thought from 2024. And some of the evangelical leaders that took shots at Moscow or Cross Politic, who've been well known historically inside of Christendom, the Reformed Christendom, I found when I was paying attention to where they were in the conversation publicly, I found that they were quite irrelevant in the public conversation of ethics, morality, politics, church in the civic area. They weren't there public. There wasn't a public voice from the guys that we've known historically in Christendom since I can think of for 25 years. I say the Mount Rushmore of Christendom, right? They weren't there. And a lot of the older guys are getting close to see Jesus. They're about to get an upgrade. Let's call it that. And this new group is rising up, but there's some that's kind of been in their shadows that are rising, but they just haven't been anywhere talking about the topics that I think are very, very relevant to evangelicals right now. And I want to hit on some of those. And I want to walk from the things that are kind of important in the face of everything. Like, for instance, HB1, MAGA movement on immigration. I still have yet to hear a top-line evangelical break down and work through a biblical understanding of immigration in some sort of series or setup. That's just not we don't have the public ear to be able to talk about those things. Those things aren't even basic conversations inside of seminaries. And so, so I want to talk about HB1. I want to talk about foreign investments inside of America. What do you think the idea of that is, especially with since we're trying to push back on immigration so we can kind of get an identity of our country? And then I want to talk about your books for 2025. Why? Because you came up, I talked to you and I said, hey man, I want to grab 12 books that you think are super important to read for 2025. And I think you just came up with 6.
I've only sent you a list of 7.
Okay, let's start there.
Those are the ones I'm mailing to you this week.
Oh, snap. Okay, what's the 7?
So the 7 that I sent over to you were actually basically the major works of that Clark has done that I think are really standout works. So Gordon Clark. So being a Clarkian in terms of how I think about apologetics, and I think about the understanding of human knowledge.
And Trinity.
What's that? And the Trinity. That's right. The doctrine of the Trinity. So there's a book. Basically, the 7 books were Christian philosophy, which is a compilation of some smaller books of his, where he engages with the questions of how we know and our dependence upon the scriptures that God has provided for us. And that in contrast to the claims of human knowledge from secular philosophy and also religious philosophy. And then he has a single volume history of philosophy called Thales to Dewey. And Thales is this guy who's a Greek philosopher who sort of the guy who's viewed as sort of the first philosopher on record. Now, I think that's silly because I think that the scriptures deal with philosophy far more deeply, far earlier. You have Solomon writing 1000 BC about the question of the good and, how do we make it so life's not meaningless? But just in terms of secular philosophy studies, people typically start with Thales. And then John Dewey was a really huge influence in modern America in terms of pragmatism and behaviorism and the way that people think about education in America. The educational establishments have dramatically been influenced by him. So that's Clark's single volume, Thales to Dewey, which is, I think, the best single volume history of philosophy that exists. The second one was actually written by an atheist, by Bertrand Russell. His history of philosophy is probably the second best single volume history of philosophy. But the third one is a little tiny book that's about 60 pages long. It's made up of 2 small books together, a 30-page book that's written by Augustine called Of the Teacher. And it's him talking. It's a little dialogue, and it feels a lot like a Platonic dialogue. If you read, the writings of Plato, where there's this kind of back and forth discussion, right? Well, with Of the Teacher, you have Augustine talking to his son Adeodatus, who sadly passed away very young. And so it's this little discussion, and it's kind of like, it feels like, Augustine and his son are kind of like walking through the garden, just kind of talking. And they're talking about the fact that humans can't teach humans. And in fact, all teaching relies upon the inward work of God in terms of illumination. And so it's kind of built off of this idea that your teacher is one. Christ is the teacher. And so it talks about the work of the Holy Spirit in that.
It sounds like he's picturing the walking with Adam in the cool of the day, kind of the same sort of narrative kind of going, there's a story. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And the second part of that is a little 30-page thing where Clark deals with some serious considerations about how sense experience works. So these are all things that are basically thrillers that everybody's going to stand like, it's just a page turner. You're sitting there in bed like, I'd like to sleep, but I just can't fall asleep because of all of this technical analysis of Mel Blanc's occasionalism.
But that's the thing. When I asked you for something to read, I wanted something that was going to be engaging and entertaining. I didn't think that I was going to have to work, David. Well, 2 books on philosophy and epistemology. My goodness.
Well, I mean, they're page turners. These are thrillers. These are basically. These are like John Grisham novels. Basically, is what I'm saying.
You gave me the Augustine book. Is it Augustine of the Teacher?
Yeah,
that's going to keep me alive. Okay, next.
yeah. I had to put a little bit of sugar into the medicine.
So before can I just, so as we're going through this, and I want to get there to the rest of it, but before we go any further, why are we working through Christian philosophy? Basically, epistemology is what you're working through here on the first book, right?
Yeah. I mean, so I think the question of knowledge is the most important thing to figure out because it controls everything else that you think about. So
How do you know this?
yeah, right. So your whole system of thought, everything you think about, is there's three major questions to answer. The most basic one is how do you know? The second one is what's real. So and that's called metaphysics. The answer to that, right? So how do you know is epistemology. Metaphysics is what's real, and then what's good, and that's ethics, right? So,
oh, hold that. It's so funny. I just got done listening to David Bonson's first podcast for 2025. And he works through this and he starts basically laying out his foundation for how he does economics. And he says, without metaphysics, which is reality, and without epistemology, which is how do we know this, and then without ethics, which is it good, is it right, and what's wrong, then you can't have a good economic, right? And so he basically lays out, this is how I function and think and structure in order to be able to make good decisions economically about things. And it's funny because I've really planned on this year becoming completely engulfed into economics because I think all those things tie in together along with civic interaction, right? Like that's like a huge point. And so it's funny that you're giving me these books around that topic, at least with Clark, because that's exactly where I plan to go, like just drill down. So that's perfect. Keep going.
Yeah. Regarding economics, by the way, just my biggest problem giving the last 5 books is I really want to give you a lot more, right? But the thing about economics is there are 2 series that I think are actually amazing.
Oh, please.
On economics. And they're one of them's video. R.C. Sproul Jr. Actually did a little video series by Compass Classroom called Economics for Everybody that is just phenomenal. And it has basically a bunch of Charlie Chaplin skits being used in it as clips to demonstrate economic principles, along with just walking through some really good biblical principles. So it's really a fantastic little series, and each video is like 22 minutes or whatever. And so it's just this little great little thing. I watch it with my kids and stuff. It's a great series. The next one is not quite as entertaining, and it's a couple of collections by John W. Robbins, who did this great. He was trained as an economist and as a political philosopher, and he was sort of theonomist in some ways. He didn't believe in applying the first table of the law in the civil sphere, but his economic teaching is magnificent. And he
what was it called?
It's basically, if you go to there's a website called the Trinity Foundation, and they've got 2 collections, collection 1 and 2, on their audio stuff. It's just that's what it is. So you just go to their audio lectures, and he's got 2 collections on economics, introduction and intermediate, and
they're free?
But they're free. Yeah, they're free. So the Compass in the Classroom one costs money, but this one is this one's free. And so he also wrote a series of essays on economics called Freedom and Capitalism, which are really good at a lot of points where he just walks through things. I think economics is super important for self-government. It helps you to understand rational choice, and then also understanding biblical principles of economics in terms of political liberty.
Yeah, that's right.
What are the limits on civil government in terms of what should be done? So there's also moral things where everybody wants to say like, oh, if you make too much money, that's wrong or whatever. It's like wow, you don't see that in the Bible. I mean, right. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and tells us to go, to take them over. So that's not the problem. So I think economics is super important for self-government. For you think about certain moral principles, and you're also thinking about civil liberty. And so anyway, sorry, you brought up economics. And
no. So you have, okay, so we're at number 4. What's number 4? So of the teachers, number 3.
Yeah. So I think once you move past thinking about a kind of the initial systematic elements of how do you know, I think that there's the other, you have to move on to metaphysics, and the most essential element of reality is God, right? Differentiating God as creator from the creature. And so when you're thinking about God, you need to define what divinity is in terms of the divine essence or God's incommunicable attributes. And then you also need to think about the persons of the Godhead. And so the book, The Trinity by Clarke, I think does that magnificently. And he essentially lays out the essence of God as divinity itself, the answer to the question, what is God? And then talks about the persons as the question of who is God. And so what is God is one, who is God is three. And he lays that out. So
like I hope I have that book.
Okay.
Oh,
so I will delete it from the list and replace it with something.
Okay, I got another one. All right. Okay, let's keep going. So the Clarke on the Trinity, that's really helpful.
So then when you move from there in terms of thinking about divinity, you need to then also, when you think about creation, you think about things like the divine decrees and all that. If I were talking to somebody else, this list was a list designed for you, but I think if I were dealing with somebody else, I would go to the divine decrees and predestination, because that's sort of the next step is, okay, well, here's God and here's his decrees. And so that's the work that God does on, in terms of creating and then governing. But so we don't have that here. But
I don't care about anybody else, just myself. So
okay, well, good. I mean, that's me too. I'm just glad to hear about you. So that's not on the list for that reason.
If they want a list of books, they can contact you at davidreece.com or something like that. I don't know.
They want a list of books. Yeah, they can. You can find me at puritan.church.
So
contact there.
So the decrees of God are his eternal purpose according to the counsel of his own will, whereby for his own glory he has foreordained everything that comes to pass.
Yes.
Simple, basic. If you don't have a Westminster Confession of Faith and don't have it beat down into your system and the larger catechism, you need to do that for 2025.
Yes.
Beat it into your system. And I think it's good to learn multiple Bible verses that go along with it, and just read the Bible verse to go along with it.
Yes.
Because I think what the confession is doing is trying to help us have a summary of what we believe the scriptures are teaching as a whole around this topic. And so this really helps you to have the categories. And as soon as you said decrees of God, I mean, there's multiple things you said, but as soon as you said decrees of God, I'm thinking like, well, okay, I know exactly. By the way, that kind of thing that I just did that's the childish level. That's the baby level. Right? Like, I just did a quote. It's like, that's what we teach our kids. But most Christians today don't have that built inside of their system that they can pull that out. But by the time you're a middle-aged student, you should have those things rooted so deeply in your system that you have another way of framing it that it comes out of your mouth, right? But we should spend 2025 getting the larger catechism, the Westminster Confession of Faith, pounded into your mind and into your heart, so that when something comes up, you can reference it and say, okay, this is what the Bible says about it. I know this is wrong or right based off of that. Anyway, go ahead, David.
Yeah, no, and just to add on to that, Solomon says that the words of the masters of assemblies are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. I think that the Westminster Standards have effectively captured the maturing of the church, and kind of edited out the noise of the growth process. And so you have the preservation of the signal and the getting rid of the noise. And so I think the Westminster Standards really save a ton of time. Solomon also said at the end of Ecclesiastes, of the making of books there is no end, and the way in which it's wearisome to the soul to study a bunch of stuff as opposed to having concise, clear, excellent things to study. And the Westminster Assembly has given to us concise, clear, excellent material to study to help us to understand what the scriptures teach in a systematic way, just like you said.
Well, and I think too, if you're a writer, you should take that into consideration. Like,
yeah,
I mean, don't write you should write things that get them out of your head and be like, okay, how do I make this so someone can digest it really quickly? And learn. This is why learning good prose is so helpful, right? Like that's anyway. That's one of the things I was thinking about. Okay, so what was that book?
Well, so in talking about the decrees,
Yes.
okay. So I didn't necessarily share one on the decrees, but if I were gonna pick ones on the decrees right now, the best I could limit it down to is basically I can't. There's so many. What's that?
Don't pick one then. We were supposed to have 12 books. We're just at 5 right now.
Well, if some of the best books on the decrees of God, Warfield put together a collection of Calvin's writings on predestination, and it's called Calvin's Calvinism. That's how it's published, because it was meant to be. There was this big effort amongst scholars to be like, Calvin and the Calvinists disagreed, and so there was this effort to like make Calvin soft on the decrees of God, and so Warfield's response was to pull together his writings on this subject, and he also has a little book called On the Bondage and Liberation of the Will. But so those are great, but they're harder to read because of the older style. But I love them, and also like you read people from the Reformation, and like the way they insult people is so amazing. If nothing else, you just pick up on how to insult people better when you read Calvin or Luther and their polemical writings from the Reformation era. And
that's a page turner for you. Ooh, what an insult! Thou foul demon.
right. I mean, like what? One of the best insults of all time was Luther when Cardinal Cajetan was sent to judge him, and his response was, "The man is no more fit to judge the matter than an ass is fit to play a harp." And
I'm still in it.
Right. I mean, so you just think about it, and it's like, okay, something with hooves and it trying to play a harp, and you're like, this is amazing. As an insult, it's grade A, like it's S level, right? It's an S level insult.
Is anybody gonna say the word ass? I don't think anybody's gonna say that, but I think that's perfect.
I mean, there was a period of time where we were reading the law as a regular part of our order of worship, and we were using the King James version, and it mentions not coveting your neighbor's ass, and so the thing, it would always get these chuckles out of like the kids that were new, like that were visitors, and it was just like, we're talking about donkeys, and so
like, yes, we know. Okay, so we got Calvin's Calvinism.
But sorry, so that's that. The easiest ones in terms of dealing with some of the basic issues of predestination and God's decrees. That Clark has, again, I think Clark's one of the clearest and best writers, and also one of the most concise in terms of the positive construction. And so he wrote Predestination, which does a great job of pulling together the biblical texts. He also wrote a little booklet called God and Evil, which deals with the philosophical issues and deals with a answer to the question of God and evil, and the theodicy. And so then you have also Pastor Brian Schwartley has an excellent little booklet called Sovereign Grace, and it's this little booklet that deals with the 5 points of Calvinism. The problem is the 5 points of Calvinism deal with lots of complexity of all sorts of other issues. So systematically, I wouldn't typically want to just like put the 5 points of Calvinism into dealing with predestination at this point. And so
right,
those are the books that I think are really amazing on this, that are pretty short and great.
Okay, so basically, you gave me 3 books for 5. Okay, let's move on to 6. I like it. This is good. My bookshelf is going to be fantastic.
Well, so yeah, so I cut that out for yours because I think you already you have a super strong understanding of that from what we were talking about before, and I think you have a strong understanding of all this stuff. But I didn't realize this list was going public. I was just going like, if I were going to talk to you about stuff, and I were like trying to maximize the stuff that I could hand over to you and help to us sharpen each other and get pushback from you on or whatever. These were me going, okay, this is the stuff that I. A lot of stuff I've given to people I'm training or to my own family, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so
I told you, I don't care about anybody else. I only care about me. And here's what's important. Like, I know that we talk, and so you're a friend and a dear friend. And so you know things and you know what I do. And so you know things about me most people don't. And so then you know how to help craft me around being better at speaking, thinking, economics. You know what to help to benefit not just me, but the audience. So in one sense, I'm asking for myself, but because I talk publicly, I know that these are things that if I learn them, I'm passing them off to everybody else. So that's, of course, it's going to be public one way or another. But go ahead. I want to get to the rest of this because I have some questions about HB1, and I can't wait to hear your answers.
Okay. So the next thing is after the Trinity, moving past the decrees and all that, I'd want to deal with the doctrine of man. Man as the
anthropology.
Yeah, and so
who do you have here?
So this was also difficult. I limited it down to one. And so what I was trying to deal with is in the doctrine of man, very few people capture everything I'd want to see there. And so when you're dealing with the doctrine of man, I mean, the reality is ethics is really a huge study of the doctrine of man, right? So the study of the law of God later down in the system is still that. The whole, Calvin starts the Institutes and says, the whole of true and sound wisdom is basically gathered together under two heads of doctrine: what we're to believe about God, and what we're supposed to believe about ourselves, man. And you find that the Shorter Catechism organizes that in that same way too. And the Dutch called it the double knowledge. So the Reformed tradition has always emphasized this. That the Shorter Catechism has, what does the Scriptures principally teach? What man is to believe concerning God and what duty God requires of man. And so these two heads of doctrine. So when you think about man, you're spinning. There's tons to do there because you're thinking about not only what is man and what is his the image of God, and what is the duty of man. And so you have the whole law and what are you supposed to do, and what about the covenant institutions and what are you supposed to do. And so there's all that fleshing out. So you can't deal with all of that.
That's how the law is broken up too, if you think about it, right?
Right. So you can't deal with all of that in like a basic thing. So when we get we're talking about the metaphysics of man, we're trying to deal with two basic questions, which is, what is man? You can't say that without saying like that you were mindful of him.
I know. I keep thinking every time you say that, what is man that you are mindful of him? Every time it hits in my head. In sermons, all the times I ask a question like, what is whatever, to like cue up the congregation to think about a definition. Whenever I say what is love, I'm always like restraining myself from saying, baby, don't hurt me. Like, that one's less admirable than the psalm that we were both immediately thinking of. But anyways, so those questions of like, what is man? And then you're also thinking like, who is man? In terms of, and so you go, well, every individual person, but the starting man is of course Adam. Right? With the who, we start there. And then we also have the second Adam, Christ, the greater Adam. And so we think about, who is man? What is man? We're talking about the nature of man, the definition of man. Who is man, in terms of the individuals. And that's important because the who is man, if you don't acknowledge the proper definition of the nature of man and who man is, you're going to start excluding out persons, and you're going to say, well, these aren't people, or these aren't people. We can kill them because they're not about the Jews,
right? So we can go through whatever divisions of man we want. If we try to exclude certain who's, that's going to largely be probably because we've got a different view of what man is.
This is really important. This isn't the conversation I really want to get too deep into yet, because I think there's some principles that we need to lay out. But I was thinking about this. I was looking through history, and one of the things that a lot of people who are on the other side of the conversation, closer towards anti-Semitism, and some who are anti-Semites, I think, they are doing history in a lot of ways that a lot of people didn't know about. Like I was doing some reading, found out that, was it 1174 or sometime around that? Maybe it was earlier than that. But was it the Jews got kicked out of England at some point, and they just like banished them, like just out. That's just crazy to me to think about people banishing your own citizens at some point. And I think they were. I haven't done all the history, but I think they were citizens. And then they come back in though through Cromwell, And so I think, and I've heard, it's so funny because the conversation isn't just in evangelical circles that people are having these. The conversation about the Jews is everywhere, and everybody's talking about it. On the most secular podcasts, they're talking about it. I saw on Flagrant, that Andrew Schultz was talking about, and he had made the joke. He's like, if somebody who gets kicked out of every bar in New York, and you go around and say, wow, those are some messed up bars, like you'd be thinking for yourself, like maybe it's not the bar, right? And so, so everybody's having the conversation about this. But I was thinking about this, and I was thinking to myself, if
the Jesuits have gotten kicked out of a lot of bars too, by the way, just as a side note. Just want people to think about the Jesuits.
It must be the bars. But here's the deal. I was thinking about this. Like, if you are a biblical, theonomic thinking person, and you apply the law of God with the blindfold on, whatever sins that come up in the civic realm that are crimes, you judge them to the point that you make restitution and squelch out the crimes and the sin and push into the dark and bring real justice. You solve a lot of the problems I think that you would get out of any group of people acting a particular way and taking advantage of systems, right? So I think part of our problem in this is that we haven't been ruling well in how we do justice, right? Because then we don't apply the word of God where we should, and then we create pockets and areas and places for anyone to take advantage of, right? And so I think that we have to, there has to, if we apply the word of God properly around to every area, especially in the civic realm where we see crimes, it seems like it would take care of a lot of our problems around this issue and around these questions. Instead, we don't.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is exactly right, that principles of justice universally applied make it so that if we have definitions for crimes and we apply them to all persons equally under law, then we simply have a mechanism for removing the worst offenders and of making everything work better. I mean, so that's the problem, is a failure of the administration of justice.
That's right.
So we have to have a proper law code, and we have to have a proper mechanism for dealing with the keeping of the peace and the executive function of arresting and arraigning and pulling before a judiciary that those criminals. And then we also have to have an effective judicial system of applying that law. And so that's the thing that's difficult. And the reality is, corruption in government leads to a corruption of the administration of law. And so principles for evaluating law and principles for evaluating magistrates are kind of the big functional choices that we have to deal with in terms of the ordering of a civil order.
So then this book on anthropology, what is it? You said you had to pick one.
Yeah. So if I had to pick one, and I'm really just going down to the whatness of man, the very minimum here, you're looking at something that analyzes what human nature is and defining that in terms of a body and in terms of a soul. And so again, shocker, I think Gordon Clark has done an amazing job doing that in the most concise way possible. And so his book, The Doctrine of Man, does that. And so the reality is,
I get it. So just buy the library of Gordon Clark, and I got all the books that I need for 2025.
Yeah, that'd be good. He wrote about 40 books. So that was I had to pick from that. So the whole list of the 12 is really just my best of the 40 to hand over to you.
The list of the 12 is how to make you a Clarkian. That's what this is. I see what you took the opportunity to do. Got it.
Force feeding Gordon Clark. No, I originally was talking to my daughter about this, about like, well, which books should I do here? I was like, this one's not as good, but I don't want to look like I'm just handing somebody a bunch of stuff to read. Gordon Clark. And she was like, Dad, he's your friend. Just give him whatever book you think is the best one on the top.
Yes.
He asked you to do.
That's right.
And I was like, okay, so
yeah.
So that doctrine of man, I think is there. And then you think about this, the doctrine of God and the doctrine of man together is how you start to deal with the doctrine of the incarnation. And so, because there's the second person of the Trinity, eternal God, took to himself by the power of the Holy Spirit, conceiving in the womb of the Virgin Mary, a human body and rational soul. and that there's a union there where this humanity is added to the second person, and there's without conversion, there's no change. Without composition, there's not a slapping together of the parts of humanity and divinity. Without a confusion, it's not a mixing together into like some chemical concoction, and it was without conclusion. It lasts forever. And so,
and if you're learning this for the first time, we call that the hypostatic union.
That's the hypostatic union. That's right. And so you have everything necessary there for a divine person, and you have everything necessary there for a human person, but it's a unity. And so there's nothing lacking. So he's like unto us in all ways except without sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a complete human nature. And so that union is the one person, Jesus Christ. And so that one person, Jesus Christ, is, we have to know about divinity and we have to know about humanity. And so when you're talking about the incarnation, that's extremely important. And also when you're thinking about how does this work in terms of how do I avoid all sorts of errors, like patripassionism, like did the Father suffer on the cross? No, the Father didn't suffer on the cross.
Right.
The Son suffered on the cross. Did he suffer in his divinity? No, because that would violate the impassibility of God. And so how did he suffer? Well, in his humanity. And so you deal with all this stuff, and so you work through those things. So that is I think super important. And I think reading chapter 7 of the Westminster Confession, dealing with the mediator, maybe it's chapter 8. Maybe I'm remembering which one. So 7 and 8, I think, are like the covenant and like the mediator. But anyway, so you've got you got to deal with that. And so if you look at that, deal with the scripture texts and work through the history of it, those things are extremely important. And then the last one on the list that I've sent to you so far is on the atonement. And so the seventh one is the atonement.
By Clark.
Yes. So I think my goal is to the rest of them, the other subjects are not Clark books, but the
is this can I so let's just say that, okay, so we're working through 12. I asked for 12. What you basically did, if I'm paying attention to this, you kind of gave me, with exception for the anthropology, but the anthropology for you is more dealing with we can just move that to the bottom of the list, almost like the hinge for the other 6 or 7. This is like your first table of the law.
Yeah. So, and I think if you weren't, I mean, you were already Sabbatarian, so I wouldn't necessarily do something there. Although actually one of the books I'm considering giving to you does relate to that. I'm just going to mention it right now, whether it gets on the list or not, but there's a magnificent book called The Market Day of the Soul.
The Market Day of the Soul.
Yes. Here's the beautiful picture here. You think about think about older culture back when there was a market day, when people like, you'd be working on the farm, you'd be working wherever in the village, you'd have your shop and you're like dealing with things. But then there'd be like a day that was like a designated day of the week or of the month where merchants would come by from other towns. And so you'd have kind of like towns that were in a circuit or whatever. And they would each have a market day that was the day when you would expect merchants to come together. And so you think about like a farmer's market is kind of like an example of what's like. But like, before you have malls, before you have a bunch of shops, before you whatever, like how do you make it so that people can trade efficiently? Because imagine you go, I've got this thing that I want to sell. And you're like, well, how am I going to sell it? Am I going to go walk from house to house? Or am I going to go like sit out in the city square and wait for everybody to talk to me about buying this thing from me? No, you have a designated time where everybody comes and they can do their barter and selling. And it facilitated this. This idea that people are coming together and sharing all the goods they've got and doing trades, doing exchanges to be useful to each other. And the kind of excitement of like your bargain hunting and trying to like, engage with each other, and people would exchange information and share the news and do all these deals, right? So now if the Sabbath is the market day of the soul, you have all these spiritual goods that you have in the communion of the saints. And like you've been in your private study and meditation in your worship of God, gathering these things, and you've been doing family worship and doing this stuff. And the pastor's been studying to be ready to teach and all this stuff. And so the market day of the soul, people are sharing with each other and exchanging with each other all these spiritual blessings. And so you have the public worship, you have in the morning and the evening, you have the idea of your private worship still, you have your family worship still. And besides that, you're trying to spend your time in fellowship in holy conference. And holy conference is talking to share the things of God. And so this beautiful picture of the market day of the soul. And then it goes through a history talking about the comparison of the Puritan view of the Sabbath versus the Anglican, or the view of it that was imposed by the kings. And in particular, they'd have the book of sports, because they wanted to get the people to use the Lord's Day besides the time they were in church. They wanted them to do sports because it was a type of combat training. And it was a way of like using the Lord's Day to keep the people of the nation fit for combat, is how the sport, and also to keep them from doing other things that the king might not prefer them to do. And so this idea of the book of sports was a big part of the controversy of like which sports were considered lawful according to the king for the Lord's Day. And so the Church of England put that, and the Puritans generally, they were required by law to read this book of sports from the pulpit. And so what they generally did is their response was to say, we have been required by the king to read this from the pulpit as an announcement. They would read it, and they would promptly kind of give the, don't do this, or you get church discipline, for going around and doing that, as opposed to keeping the Lord's Day in the Puritan manner. So I think the engagement, the arguments that occurred there, is really, you have the first time that there's sort of in England during this time, you have this systematic engaging and a capturing of all the arguments between sort of a Roman Catholic view of the Lord's Day that was sort of maintained by the Episcopal establishment, the Puritan view, and you also have, interestingly, the rise of sort of a seventh day Sabbath, like an Old Testament view, amongst some people who were arguing that it doesn't transfer to the first day of the week. So you have these three things being compared, and it's one of the most efficient and interesting ways that I've ever seen laid out, the way that this controversy developed in terms of in kind of English view of the Sabbath and the competing views. So anyway, sorry, for me, that's super exciting.
Yeah, that actually is. No, that's really exciting. I was thinking about, so who's the author of that?
I don't remember. I'd have to check. It was not a guy that I've read a lot by, but this little work was great. So I'll get back to you on that. I'll add it to the list of the 12.
No, that's definitely, I'm looking for it too. The reason that I like that is because I believe that what happens on the Lord's Day is a model of how the world is designed to work. You got the table, you have prayer, you have the fellowship of the saints, and the free market of the soul is perfect, because everything you described there, if you are practicing that as the first day of the week, and that is something that models out how you do the rest of the week. The things that you work to bring value to a free market economic culture, to your neighbors throughout the rest of the week, is modeled on how you worship on the Lord's Day. So then you're searching for things of value to bring your neighbors to discuss around the glory of the Lord and how he's made the world. Like, oh, this is so glorious, because it's not just information that you're sharing. To do something like this is to say, wow, you thought enough about me, and because you love the Lord, that you want to bring me the kind of knowledge that can change the way that my family runs, the way that I think to put off sin, the way that I think to work. And so you bring value to your brethren on the Lord's Day, and you work throughout the week to do that. Like, I got something I can't wait to share with you. This is going to be so good. Or guess what I just found out? Or guess what I just learned? Bro, you're going to really love this. Like, and that creates a culture that then breeds free markets. And it all comes from worship. And I think we've forgotten that. And so the free market of the soul, for me, is fitting inside this idea that I've been working through, which is Calvinistic cosmology, right? We've lost that. We've been arguing about Calvinistic soteriology for a long time, and not understood that even the people who are arguing against Calvinistic soteriology live in a Calvinistic cosmology in America, right? They just, everything that they do, they don't even know it. And that's one of the things I want to work through and bring out as we're working through Civic Covenanting throughout this year. Hopefully we can go longer than April and do this. So, okay, so that's the Sabbath of the Soul is like the last book on your first table.
Yeah, so I think those that's where I would stop there. I think that there's, well, actually, I'm not sure about that. I have that's some. So the other books that I'm thinking about here may also still engage there. So I want to not reveal the other ones
Okay.
because I am still trying to edit down. I got, when I put together the list I started to pull together, I started thinking about like systematically what would cover it. Okay, where do I know you're really strong on stuff? Where are you trying to learn more? Where are places, even if you're strong, that it's still super important to cover as a thing that's like, this is still really helpful or great in this class, and it's on such an important subject that it's still worth looking at the book. That was sort of how I was going through it. So my list was super long, and I started to pare it down and started to talk through that. So I had close to 100 books on my list of like thinking about what, and then I'm trying to delete it down. So that's how I went through this. I took this seriously. You told me you'd read 12 books if I could pull it. I was like, how do I make this maximally useful for you and make it and try to make it so that I could encourage? And I started to think about, I needed to pull together for some of the stuff we're doing with officer training and mentorship at our church, that as well. So I took this project and kind of expanded it out. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so, yeah. And again,
maybe we need to go through 100 books. I'm no Doug Wilson. I don't get through 100 books a year. Doug gets through like 120 or something like that a year. Every year is 140. I don't know, some crazy number. I thought 12 to really focus on. Yeah. I go through probably, because I do a lot of audio books, so as much free time as I can, I put it in there. So I probably go through, at the end of the day, 40, 50 books a year, if I think about it. But it's never the books that I really want to go through. I end up going through, as people come on the show, so I do probably 20 books there, and read their books. And it's not the books that I have on my list. The books I have on my list keeps growing. So I was like, okay, this year I'm focusing on just a short amount of books that I want to read that's going to be essential, because I think the most important thing to do right now is to understand biblical theology that is immediately applicable for people to engage with. Mm-hmm. People are learning things that the kind of battle that we are currently in is the kind of battle where people have the enemy at the gates. You have to learn doctrine and to be able to use it at the same time. You have to be able to get an idea and the process in your head and be able to apply it on the field, because we don't have an enemy that we can put the scope on and silo a missile off, that's over in another. No, our enemy is right next to us. We have the enemy right here in our own camps that we have to do hand-to-hand combat with. This thing is so crazy. You don't have time to reach for a gun. You just immediately fighting every day, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to find things that, okay, how can I understand this as quick as possible? And then as soon as I get done understanding it, use it to engage in battle. And I don't think anybody who's not doing that right now, I don't think they're going to matter in real life, right? You don't have the luxury of, I'm just going to say, I don't think you have the luxury anymore, if you're an older person, of having a 6-year, 4-year education on things. You have to be fighting. It's a sword and shovel right now. That's it. You're on the wall, you're rebuilding. And so you have to have some sort of application. And so whoever's teaching, whoever's learning, they just need to know that's where we're at. And so that's why I was asking for this set of books. Because so go ahead.
And to get a person to be ready to fight as fast as possible, I think one of the key things is understanding that that's like what the shorter catechism is designed for. Yes. So you have questions 1 through 38 give you the basic doctrine of the knowledge of God, and then you get questions 39 through 81 tell you your basic duties using the 10 commandments to outline that, and then you have 82 through 107 as giving you how to use the word, sacraments, and prayer, and so these are the outward and ordinary means of grace that help you to grow. But the whole law of God are also ordinary means of grace, and so what gets listed, the outward and ordinary means of grace are word, sacrament, prayer, and all of the ordinances of Christ. And so the ordinances, meaning broadly his laws. And so you think about, and when you think about that last part of the shorter catechism, word, sacrament, prayer, it's basically telling us an expansion of the second commandment. Mm-hmm. The second commandment is how to worship. And so worship is our warfare. And so this is such a great little document for giving people the very basic training of being a Christian soldier. And I think that it is designed to be milk to prepare people to become strong and to become able to eat meat.
That's good, man. All right, so I want to talk about kind of do you make New Year's resolutions? Do you do any of that, or you're a Puritan, so none of that stuff matters to you? Of course, Edwards has 70.
Yeah, so the resolutions, so resolutions, right? So when you think about resolutions, they're either covenanted, you're either vowing to God, or you're swearing to other people, or it's just you're resolving in terms of like setting your affections there. There's a great little book on the practice of biblical meditation. It's called God's Battle Plan for the Mind.
Ooh, I just love the title.
It's a great book. It's short, which is also great, and it's available as an audiobook. And so when everything can be short and can be an audiobook and still be great, that's amazing.
This show is loaded with so much potential content just through these books and working through. I'm telling you, like I could just go back and be like, okay, I got my goodness. All right. So
the idea of resolutions, right? Meditation starts with this idea of there's two types of meditation that are Christian meditation. One is deliberate meditation where you're setting apart time. So think about like private worship.
Uh-huh.
And the other one is occasional meditation. So think about like you're walking around, looking around, and you interpret the world using the Word of God, right? So occasional meditation, you're applying the Word of God to your experiences. And then deliberate meditation, you're sitting down with an intention to meditate on the Word of God. So this deliberate meditation is sort of you're sitting down and you're reading the Bible. Right? So you think about private worship. You have prayer, Bible reading, and psalm singing, and so you're praying for God to give wisdom. You go in, you read the Bible. You then are trying to nail down the meaning of the text, and you're trying to maybe you have to study to do that. But then you've figured out the meaning of the text. You then need to really mold it over in terms of, okay, how do I apply this to my thoughts and to my words and actions? And that application piece is where the meditation lies, is it's drawing out the universals to particulars. And then the last part is you resolve yourself, you gird up your loins for battle and go, I must apply this. And so when I think about resolving, it's the I must apply this. And so you sort of end with prayer and thanksgiving, with the offering of the fruit of the lips of the psalm, and this idea of you're leaving private worship having resolved to apply what you've taken in from the Word of God. That's how I think about resolutions. And then you can organize those, right, into like sort of like, here's what we're resolved to do, here's what I'm committed to do. You can write that down. And so that sort of collections of those things. But that's how I think you get kind of sort of what Jonathan Edwards put together with his resolutions.
So then, because I feel like you just kind of skated right past my question while all you did was define it. And I think that was great. But the question is, let me reframe it for your Puritan mind. What is it that you plan to apply in 2025?
Yeah. So for myself, one of the things that I've realized is I have been running redlining for a long time. And I think the Lord has started withdrawing some of my energy and strength to just kind of constantly redline. And he's put around me a number of godly men that I'm able to lean upon and work with more. And so I'm where I am in life, I'm realizing more and more the need to do that. And so I've been trying to develop people, train people, find people to work with, all that kind of stuff. And so just an increasing effort there. So resolving to do less to a large extent, and to also try to focus in on creating more content, and to be able to try to make that useful for the people of God. And I'm actually, I've been working through a lot of things. I have sort of a quarterly planning time, and I've got some conversations later today, even during this week, where I'm trying to work through that and cut down. A mutual friend of you and I, Paul Gomez, says amplify and edit. Right, that's like one of his
yeah.
And so that idea of amplify or edit and amplify, reducing down, figuring out what to really kind of pour into. So I think that's what I've been resolving to do. And also just my kids are starting to get older and older, and the idea of pouring into them. And as we've been able to divide up things in terms of church, organizing more and more into sort of a parish system, we've been able to try to focus in on kind of how do you pour in a way that's effective, that allows for overflow into other people. So that sort of focused effort and reducing the trying to do it all is sort of one of my major resolutions. And that's hard, because when you try to not do it all, you stop believing the lie that you can do it all. Which is, I like lying to myself that I can do it all.
One of the things that I've been, for myself, since I think economics is so important, one of the people I think has a great handle on has been Thomas Sowell. And so I just went and got as much Thomas Sowell books as I could afford, and one of the things that he's been helpful, and then what's the other guy's name that has been really helpful, some basic economic stuff. Let me find it, because I think it was good. Oh, by the way, I bought God's Battle Plan for the Mind. That is a book by David Saxton.
Yeah.
But Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt.
I've heard of it. I've never gone through it, or I actually might have listened to part of it or something, but I haven't completed it.
Yeah, he's been really good. But one of the things that they've helped me understand, is the fact that efficiency is essential. It's essential because it takes knowledge to be more efficient, and you gaining knowledge, creating more efficiency, is better for the individual buyer.
Yeah.
Which means that you make more money to be more valuable to them, which allows you more knowledge to be able to make more products more efficiently to drive the cost down, or it becomes so valuable that it only supplies it for a certain group of people who can afford it, right? That which is fine, but it's able to do it at a cost that they're able to purchase it, right? So your knowledge of something and you being efficient and being able to bring that product to somebody at a very affordable price or inexpensive price drives up value for you.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm learning is that we work really hard to be inefficient because we value the wrong things. So, and this is something that's really, I'm kind of at the beginning of really grasping it, but I'm watching historically America has been so concerned about protecting jobs that we dehumanize men, right? We don't think that they can think or they can do anything else other than just hard physical labor.
Right.
For instance, like the trucking industry right now is under threat because of self-driving semi trucks. And they're saying, well, we need to have regulations around this because there'll be thousands of men that lose their jobs. And because we have such a narrow view, instead of a biblical view or a diamond view of things, to see things from all the other angles, it's like, what about the jobs that it took to make those trucks? What about the potential opportunities that a guy with only a high school education, if that, has now an opportunity to buy a fleet of trucks that he wouldn't have been able to buy before because he can have and not have to work now. So it puts him into a different category, and he's going to have to pay for people to manage those trucks, to answer phones, to do other things. There's all sorts of other opportunities in there, but because of the way that we think and feel about men, we limit the opportunities for growth and then harm the person who is buying the product. Right. And so I'm starting to see that we rather make anything that is new or technologically advancing that would create less labor. We seek to make labor harder for people for trying to preserve jobs. And it's like that is we hurt the guy who is a worker who could possibly find another job or another area in that same job, right? Might even add advancements to this new sector.
Right.
And we hurt the buyer because we make things less than efficient for them to be able to get it, which drives up the price.
Right.
And so I'm learning that efficiency and knowledge are one of the most essential things that we can get. How can you gain the knowledge of something? And how can you be efficient about getting that product to your audience, to your people, so they can afford to purchase it? And we are so concerned about the wrong things because, and this goes back to what you were talking about with anthropology. We don't understand how God has made man what they are, and we think that if this is gone, it's a zero-sum game.
Right.
If you get a group of machines to come in and take the place of a lot of workers you have now, 50% of your work staff, and sure, that 50% is gone, but what about the other percentage that it took to make those machines that you bought, the maintenance of those machines, and what will those other peoples go and create and do now that they don't have such labor-intensive jobs to do? That's all a part of it, and we just don't have a biblical worldview, and so we end up hurting ourselves in the process. And I've been reading about this, we've had unions say, okay, listen, because we don't want to lose jobs and we know there's a more efficient way of doing this, we want you guys to ship in all of your prefab pipes that you do now inside of your little warehouses. And we're going to cut off the threaded end, and then we're going to rethread them, and then we'll put them in place. So now the job costs more. It should have cost less, and we made more work. Now we have to have more pipe, and we're making ourselves less and less efficient to serve the intended end, which is the buyer. That's who we're supposed to be serving. And so this goes back to being able, but if you have a biblical understanding of this, if you think about this the way God has designed the world, what you understand about man matters in this conversation. How has God made man to work and to live and to operate and to think? And as he becomes consistent with that, he can lose his job multiple different times as industry changes, but because of the way God has made him, he's going to adapt. But if labor was the most important thing and people keeping their jobs, then we should get rid of semi-trucks and hire people, lots and lots of people, to walk these crates, these shipping containers. We can get enough man underneath it. We can just hire them to walk them from state to state.
Right. And instead of using backhoes, we should use shovels. And actually, instead of shovels, we should use spoons. And in fact, even spoons might be taking away jobs. Maybe if we just used our fingernails to pull up the ground that we needed to.
And so so I'm just thinking, so this list, man, this is why this is so important, is because this is stuff that if we can't answer these questions, we can't deal with these problems. If we haven't worked through, what does God say? Who is God? Who is man? How has God intended man to live in this earth? And then what does that mean for civic covenanting? What does that mean for how people interact civically, right? And so one of the areas right now that everybody's talking about, are you familiar with H1b?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is one of those areas where I see, this was riveting to me. You have Elon Musk, who is like pro H1b. Then you have MAGA movement that's like, yo, about those foreign people coming into our country. Didn't we just have a whole conversation about immigration? This is just another form of that. What you doing, Elon? And you see the first rift inside of the MAGA movement, or inside of this new formed populist movement on the right. And it's fascinating. But what I haven't heard is a Christian understanding of this concept of H1B. And I think this goes also into the steel workers potential deal that I think Biden was against, I think Trump's against too. And then foreign investments that are coming inside of America. I don't think these are disconnected. These are all around the same idea. So then you got these foreign investments. People are giving billions of dollars for investment inside of America that are foreign companies, foreign nations. So I want to start with H1B first. What's your take on H1B? What's the biblical understanding of it? And where do you start at to even think about something like this as a Christian?
Yeah. So I think that the question of immigration is ultimately a question about who should control where people live. And then there's also this question of nationhood, which has been discussed so much. And there is this question of how do you deal with the problems of people, for example, from a non-Christian culture coming to a Christian culture. And so the typical answer that a lot of kind of conservative Christians.
Hold on. You can't do that. You can't mix those two, because I think you have to deal with where we're currently at and then where you want to be ideally.
Sure.
And how we get there. Because the merging of merging to a Christian culture, I don't think America has a Christian culture anymore.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, I just want to leave that there, but go ahead.
Sure. And I think discussing the ideal is always the easiest way of evaluating. You're like, okay, what's the ideal? And then you think about, okay, where are we? And like, how do we get towards that? Right. So if the ideal is you have a Christian state, the Christian magistrate, and there's the criminal penalties of God's law. So you punish blasphemy, you punish idolatry, you're punishing taking oaths by the names of other gods, you're punishing Sabbath breaking. That guards a Christian culture, and it prevents the erection of false temples and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's the thing that prevents a lot of that. The second issue is huge possession of government land makes it so that there's huge amounts of space where people can go that are not private property. And so now the government's the decider of who's allowed in on that property. Then you also have the problem of welfare.
Hold on, David. That's not something to be overlooked. So you're saying that private ownership has authority on what can happen on that property?
Yeah, the idea that I can say who's allowed onto my property is one of the big things. People talk about the problem of homelessness. It's like, well, what's going on there? There's a bunch of people that are being allowed to loiter on public land, and so we've no longer made loitering a type of trespassing on public land that's to be enforced. And so when you have government-owned land, the government has to act like the private property holder, and people have a hard time with what's supposed to be done there, because you go like, well, anything government does is criminal sanction. Whenever the government's punishing or outlawing something, it's got to have a punishment. And so the problem is there's this like, well, is it private property? Oh, it's public property. There's the public property. Do we, can we control it in the same way that we can control private property? And so the problem is once you own the land, you have to manage the details of what goes on in the land. And so the more land the government owns, the more it's going to be involved in detailed management of administration and control over things that are non-criminal.
Boy, we don't talk about that.
So that's a big part of this. And also you think about that relates to like pollution and all sorts of other problems.
Yes.
Polluters, the biggest destroyers of the beauty of land and the utility of land are governments. But so the problem of we don't enforce anything about the first table. We have huge amounts of government land. We have the government doing all sorts of stuff it's not supposed to do and not doing tons of stuff it's supposed to do.
Can I say something around the first table before you move on? Please don't lose your thought. I just want to say the reason the first table is important is because it defines everything else. Without definition, because the first table is defining what kind of place is this.
Yes.
And then what? And so if you don't have that, then you can't make any moves anywhere else. And everybody's trying to function from some other standard outside of that. And then you don't get to what should happen here because we don't know what kind of place this is. Who's in charge? The transcendent, right? You have to have a transcendent marker there. And that's what we were talking about with the first table law. This is the kind of place this is. This is whose it is. Dot the end, right?
Yes. By a civil society, by a state covenanting to acknowledge the true God and to uphold his law, it's marking the land with the word of God. And just like we're supposed to mark our house with the word of God, the land gets marked by that. And so this is the God of the system. It's the God of the Bible. And this civil covenanting allows you to say, here's the law order. This is who we are.
Yeah.
And so without that, you end up with all sorts of other unifying principles, like maybe ethnicity or whatever else. And so people attack this whole like covenant nation thing, and they try to act like there's no place for ancestry or whatever else. And it's like, no, covenants go across generations, and so
you can only think that way though if you think in a Baptistic mindset. I just want to make that clear, because when you think covenantally, your kids are already a part of this, so you have generation built into it. My grandkids are God's children. They are already, before they get here, their covenant structure is already designed for them. How they're supposed to operate, right? My line down to 1,000 generations, according to the promise of God, it's already been decided who their God is going to be. They don't get to make that decision. That's already in line for them. And that's what they need to submit to and obey, right? But if you think baptistically, then you have to say, well, covenants don't have generation lines inside of them. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. So there's the household covenant, there's the church as a covenant institution, individuals are in covenant with God, and there's the state as a covenant institution. They're all established in different administrations of covenant from God. And so you find that the state, if it is something that affects people across generations, there's this process of how do people come in to the state and become a part of the people, the nation. And the answer is to covenant, but there's also in the Old Testament this idea that you don't become a member of the assembly, the voting population, until the third generation. And that's if the nation's got a good status. There were other nations that were cursed to have more generations before their descendants could come in after the first generation covenanted. And so there's a process of assimilation into a Christian state. And it's not based upon ethnicity in terms of what we might call race or whatever. It's based upon the idea of who's covenanted in, whether it's from the past, prior generations covenanting, and you being the successors in that covenant, or whether it's you covenanting in, and then your successors have something where as they're in there and as they maintain good standing in the covenant, by the third generation, they become part of that voting population. So we have this weird birthright citizenship thing in America, and we make it so people can become voting citizens fast. We also make it so that people can be born into it regardless of whether there was a covenanting by the parents. And so we have all these problems that stack up to make it so that we don't have a lot of the safeguards, and we're in fact creating a magnet where people come here because of the welfare state and all the other things that give the handouts. And so those problems.
Can I address something there? Because we're still talking about H1b, just so everybody knows. But part of what people are concerned about in what you just defined was, so if I don't have I have to wait 3 generations before I can vote, then I have taxation without representation. How is that supposed to be something that I should be okay with if I don't have a voice in a community that I pay taxes into?
Sure. So first, there may be some sort of an exception in terms of entering into military service, because to be required for military service, you have to be a part of the assembly. And you find people like Uriah, the Hittite, coming in and being a part of the mighty men of David and all that kind of stuff. So it seems like there might be a fast track for people who do something where they're willing to be a part of the defense of the.
We've done it in America before. That's not something new for us, right?
Right. But then secondly, so that's one way of getting through the fast track in terms of that being a male obtaining the franchise. But the other thing is, if you covenant to join, then you are represented by that civil authority, and you've chosen that civil authority for yourself in terms of you entering the covenant. And your descendants, until the third generation, are in that covenant. They can break covenant and depart, or they can maintain the covenant with the recognition that there's a future citizenship right, that they're already citizens, but they're not voting citizens. And because they become citizens by the covenant, and then by the third generation, there's this franchise that comes with that. And I think that there's representation. It's just not representation by your vote. It's representation by your covenanting. And so the representation that exists is ultimately in terms of those magistrates. You think about the question of no taxation without representation. The colonial governments were not arguing that with the British government that the problem was that not all of them had the individual vote.
That's a good point.
Their whole argument was taxation without representation. The whole argument there was that the legislative power existed in the colonial assemblies, the colonial legislatures, and that their union with Britain was only through a chief executive, the king. And so the executive branch was the king, and he could appoint a governor. and then there were colonial legislatures or assemblies, and then they would also have judges that were either appointed by those governors or by the king or by their assemblies. But the point was the legislative power existed in their own legislatures. And what happened is during the time period following the restoration of the crown after the English Civil War, you had a Catholic king, James II, who was removed from office and replaced with William and Mary. And you had what's often referred to as the Glorious Revolution and the Revolution Settlement and the English Bill of Rights from 1689. And you had the rise of English Parliament. And the English Parliament started to seek to govern in ways that used to be ways that the king governed. They started to take powers from the king and to accrue them to themselves. And what ended up happening is the English Parliament started to seek to impose laws on the colonies and to impose taxes, which was the right of the colonial governments, their legislatures, and not of the legislature of Britain. And so the whole idea of taxation without representation was, this is a legislature that we don't have representatives on. We don't want representatives on it. It's a legislature taking our rights away. And so it'd be like, I live in Arizona. If all of a sudden California said, our state legislature is going to tax Arizonans. And so then in Arizona, the appropriate response would be to say, your legislature has no power here. Our legislature is who determines the tax rate here. And so the taxation without representation is about, this is a legislative body that is not our legislative body and doesn't represent us. And so that's the issue there. It's not our legislature. It's an unlawful effort to impose a tax without having any sort of jurisdiction. And so we now talk about it in terms of like individuals having the vote, but that was not the point. That was not the historical context for it. So I don't know if anybody cares about that, but I do.
I do. That's good. Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you because I just thought that was something that was in the middle of that might need to be answered. Okay, so where were you at?
So if we have all these problems in terms of immigration, we don't enforce the first table. We have too much government land, and we also have this issue of the welfare magnet system where we're kind of drawing people in and subsidizing people to come here and not work. Those are all kind of the key problems there. And then additionally, on our border guarding, we don't guard our border, and we're supposed to guard the border and have sort of customs in terms of a checking as a person's coming in. And so this idea that you're supposed to defend from invasion. And so when a group of military aged men come in as a gang, you could stop them for brigandage or stop them for being a gang or a threat or whatever. So your this ability to ask, are you checking? Are you a fleeing felon? Is there a basis to believe that this is an invading force, or and is there a public health threat in terms of like disease that's spreadable? These are things you apply on the border that's supposed to be done in terms of the government guarding the border, and so we don't have any of that. And so as a result, everybody is naturally and totally reasonably very upset about the ridiculous nature of everything, where we have people coming across the border not caring about Christian culture, not caring about the idea of working and providing value, and also not having the security or health issues guarded.
I just want to say one thing. We don't care about Christian culture either. Yeah. I wouldn't even know if that's part of people's real anger in this narrative. What they don't care about is the residue of what's left of some form or semblance of evangelicalism light.
Yeah. Sort of American culture.
Yeah, I think
the catch-all for whatever people like about America, right?
Yeah, I think that used to represent Christian culture, and it historically does. There's very little of it left inside of the system.
Right.
Anyway, but I think you're right. I agree with you and everything you just said. So then with that being said, we got all these people that are angry about this. That's what is kind of at the foundation of the MAGA movement. They've woken up and realized is that the religion, the cult of the culture has shifted so much, and we've lost so much of the potency of that cult Christianity, that we have a new culture completely moving in, and they're trying to protect it.
Yeah. And so that idea of, okay, so should the government just be handing out, making the decision of who's allowed to come in and who's not based upon criminal code, not based upon are you a fleeing felon, not based upon a national security thing, not based upon a public health issue, but just entirely based upon economic choices about a labor pool that we'd prefer to draw on. And I think it's totally reasonable to be upset about the government choosing where we should draw that in. So I believe in an openness in terms of the ability for people to be able to come and trade and do work and all that kind of stuff. That to become citizens, they have to covenant that it's not the vote until the third table being enforced. You should have the border being defended. You should not have government land that's extensively owned. And so there's, as a result, private property holders choosing all this kind of stuff. So we're not anywhere close to there. So what do we do? Should the government be, limiting who's coming in? The government should reform, repent, civil covenant, and seek to impose all of these things. That's what the government ought to do.
That's a cheat answer. So inside of the Christian world, that the Christian civic covenanted world that you want to see, how would some sort of H1b operate? Would the companies be allowed to bring someone in to work in their company? How would that be allowed?
I mean, so the short answer, yeah, you should be able to hire people. And the government should tell you, what's that?
That are not citizens.
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea that you can hire people to do work. One of the blessings that exists in terms of when a nation is honoring God is people who are not believers become the people who are the hewers of stone and the cutters of wood and the carriers of water. And so this idea that there's you're able to have other people do work for you, and that we have prosperity. The blessings of God brings prosperity, and you're able to do trade, which is just outsourcing the manufacture of something, right? When you buy something from someplace else, you're just hiring somebody else to make it for you.
But all your Christians lose Christian jobs inside of your nation because you're outsourcing all of this work.
Right. And when we stop using shovels and start using backhoes, we eliminate all the ditch diggers jobs. And so you go, well, no, the H1B is for these high paying, tech jobs and all that kind of stuff. It's just like, why do I not have the right to do with my money what I want to hire a person? Like there's a parable where Jesus literally engages with the issue of he can hire whomever he wants with his money, and he also is able to pay them whatever he wants.
But David, they're not citizens. They're not citizens, and shouldn't citizens have the opportunity to have the first jobs available to them in a nation that they live in?
That makes jobs a civil right.
And jobs are not a civil right.
Right. The government has no responsibility and no right to provide you with a job. And the government has no responsibility and no right to tell me who I'm allowed to hire. The individual has the right to choose how to spend their money and to whether to buy something from an American or to buy from a non-American. And I'm an American manufacturer. Like that's what I do, right? So I'm totally incentivized to try to encourage people to support tariffs. I'm totally incentivized to support people trying to emphasize, buy America and all that kind of stuff. Look, if I don't make a good product, people should not buy it.
Right.
And if I don't provide them good service, shouldn't buy it. They shouldn't buy it from me. They shouldn't buy a bad product from me because I'm Christian. They shouldn't buy a bad product from me because I'm American. Those are not things that are there. I should have to compete. At the same time, when you're looking at things that are relatively equal, I think, yeah, it's better to prefer a Christian over a non-Christian to do business, and also to prefer your own nation over another. I think that idea of doing that, but that's to impose that by law is illegitimate authority.
So then when you see something, so then let's say, yes, you're right. You get to employ whoever you want. That person still has to get over our borders. And we're saying, as a federal government, we're not letting anybody in America for H1B visas. So good luck.
Yeah. So then you go, okay, well, can I do a virtual hire or not, for this thing? Can I hire them to work someplace else? And that could be
they can't control your employment, period. But so if you hire somebody overseas to work here via satellite, that they're not inside of the country, And so, because
Sure.
I think part of the argument is that these H1B visas are saying people are willing to work a lot less for a lot less money than Americans willing to work, which are putting Americans out of potential jobs because we're not building and developing our own tech, or building and developing our own people around tech. And so you get people who will undercut us outside of the country on price.
Right. So let's just apply that uniformly everywhere. So we should only make everything here in America to prevent anybody from ever undercutting our prices ever. And so we should only have American oil, and we should only have American uranium, and we should only have American iron, and we should only have American whatever. Like, you just go, okay, all that has to be done in America, or can nations trade? Is there a benefit to trade or not? And so once you believe that it's useful to trade between persons, you start to realize that larger markets are more beneficial for the people in those markets. And so if you just don't believe that, if you just go, no, trading is bad. I mean, this is basically,
particularly the buyers in your nation, right?
Yeah, no, the people, the buyers are benefited. Lowering the cost of living is the great progress of economics that occurs from the expansion of markets, the improvement of methods, the increase of specialization, the development of more and more complex technologies and supply chains. And all these things combine on top of each other to make it so that we can do more and more dominion in that way. And the problem, one of the things that's difficult, a lot of Christians like kind of react against specialization. You should specialize economically, but you should be broadly educated. I want to educate my children broadly so they are able to think and be leaders. But I also want to help them to develop a particular skill set. And so you have them focus on a particular skill set, and that particular skill set becomes a place where they're good at doing some sort of work, and they develop confidence. And then they have a broad knowledge from their broader education. And then from there, they're able to go and do more, and potentially do management, having a broad education and having a specialization of capability. And so you increase their capacity to rise more and more with the idea of the American population having to compete. The only way to avoid competition is to make it illegal, or to make tariffs so high that any sort of trade outside makes it so that you're always going to choose to hire an American, or you're going to set something there. The problem with those types of policies is it makes people not competitive in the long run. It makes
mercantilism, right? That's what we're talking about.
It makes it so that people start to go, well, I don't have to work that hard to make this happen. And the result is, or I can provide inferior quality goods, and you go
higher price.
Right. And so at a certain point, you become so bad that even very high tariffs become worth paying. And that's part of what happened with the American auto industry. In terms
what
of
industry?
The American auto industry.
Okay.
So they have really bad production of stuff in comparison to, in terms of its inefficiencies, in comparison to a lot of the foreign automakers. That's part of what happened in that story. And the same thing, you find that over and over again in history with the problem. So the issue is, in the short term, they really work. In the short term, you can do socialism. In the short term, you can do tariffs. In the short term, you can do isolationism. You can do all sorts of stuff that in the short term generates a boost of certain activities. The problem is that people adapt to the incentive structures. And so in the long term, it's self-destructive. And by long term, I don't mean like, multiple generations. I mean like a generation or two, and not even a full generation. A lot of times, a lot of the negative consequences come to effect within, years or a decade or whatever. Some really interesting writing has been done, for example, on the economic boom that occurred in some of the early portion of Hitler's regime, where their initial socialism and some of the success and popularity of Hitler's regime had to do with the redistribution of goods and the taking of things and the distributing it to other people. And that also, when they invaded other countries and plundered them, that the plunder became an economic source for being able to distribute goods out to the German people. And so this has always been a mechanism that militaristic kings have used to go and you try to buy popularity, and then you try to plunder other nations to keep buying it.
What did you say about Greenland and Canada?
If they would join and not agree to vote, I would have them. But apart from that, apart from their
what did you say about this economic boom?
You just want everybody to hate me.
It's, it's funny. We just do warfare different nowadays. It's like, okay. So that was good. I gotta give myself a pat on the back for that one.
That was impressive. That was impressive.
Just trying to think copiously. So I think a lot of people don't like, you just really insulted a large portion of the MAGA movement because they want to try. I think there's a good concept here inside the MAGA movement that says America has been very much focused on outsourcing everything that it's done to other nations, outsourcing its wealth to other nations. And so there's a pendulum swing from that all the way to the other side that is focused on just America. We don't want anything outside. We don't want anything from the left or the right, from the top, from the bottom. It's just us. That's all we're going to focus on. And anything that's not that, we don't like it. What we haven't done is create a principle that doesn't allow the pendulum to swing so far the other side that we lose the blessing that's actually right in the middle where God wants us to be at.
Right.
What you've done is laid out, here is the biblical principles around the government structure, what it's supposed to do, what it's not supposed to do. This is what we were talking about before. What is the government, right? That's what you laid out with before, which is, okay, metaphysically, what is it, right? What is it for? What is it supposed to do? You laid out the ethics of it, right? Yes, good, thumbs up. And then you laid out, it doesn't work for you, does it? And then you laid out, I was writing this down. What was it? What was the last one, David?
Just the nature of immigration and the freedom of the individual to move and hire and all that, but there are certain limits.
That's the one I missed, the epistemology, right? We know it because of God's law and the table of the law, how we know things, the metaphysics of it, and then the ethics of it, right? And that created the economic structure for you to say, this is how we think through these type of things. So do you think that if this is why I think what you said about the land is really important, because I think you can move the conversation about the land to all the areas that the government is supposed to have any sort of authority over, like education. Part of the argument about H1b is that we don't have the kind of people who can think robustly about tech, so we have to hire people outside of the nation instead of people inside of the nation. And the question I want to ask with this is, well, who's teaching your people? Why is it that the freest nation in the world has some of the dumbest people a part of it? Now, I don't believe that, but I think that if that's their narrative, and wouldn't you have to look at the education system and say, we have something broken, that we don't have the kind of people that other nations that don't have freedom are able to outthink us? Right. And so you have to look at that and say, well, I don't think the government should have any authority over education either then. Because obviously what they've developed over the last 40 to 60 years or more isn't really working for our economic structures and us to be able to compete in the free market. The other thing, and I'll let you speak in just a second. The other thing I want to point out is I think we're missing something as it relates to free markets and freedom over against intelligence. We take for granted the power of the free market, so much so that we think, because here's the argument, we can't compete in technologically with these other nations because they have smarter people than us, and so we need to be able to recruit the smartest people in order to compete with these people who in other nations who are smarter than us. That's part of the argument. And I'm always willing to push back on that and say, wait, do you have free markets with free people who get to operate with their own wealth to do things? Because you're taking for granted that a person who is brilliant underneath a tyrannical Marxist socialist structure is not going to be able to advance in the same way a person with half the intelligence in a free market could. Right? Free markets give an advantage to even the most ignorant people right, to be able to produce and outproduce those who are more intelligent than them. And so we've taken for granted the blessing that we have inside the free market. Now, you don't just lean on that. But it does tip the scales in our hand. And by the way, I think we do have a lot of those people here. I think we do have a lot of them, but there's incentives not to hire them.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, but we've taken for granted that that's a huge. How do you beat markets that are Marxists, that are socialists, like Hitler and those guys? Right? How do you beat those kind of markets? How do you beat China? Free market. It's not an issue of intelligence. It's an issue of allowing the market to engage with each other with free trade. And what happens is people start figuring out better ways to bless each other more efficiently, and you outpace everybody else with free markets. We forget that's the game. Okay, I'll let you go.
No, I think that's beautiful. I think that what you've expressed there in terms of the power of markets to allow people to advance their own thing. I mean, the alternative to a free market is a market that's controlled, and the more control there is, the less you're able to do maneuvers that are lawful under the law of God that could improve your station, and the more that you have a coercive power that's preventing you from being able to do things there. And the government has fat thumbs. It does a bad job of pressing buttons, and it creates messes, and then it tries to do more to fix the messes it creates. And so it constantly uses its own power to expand its own power in response to the problems that it makes. And you move towards this process of eventual total control. And so the danger is that people are in the fallen state, naturally covetous. Not human nature in itself, but fallen human nature is naturally covetous. And so we like to use power to knock down people that we don't like, or people who have things that we don't have. And we like to try to take things from people using the power of the state. And so that, when you start to realize that you can vote your neighbor's money out of his wallet into yours, those types of things happen, which disincentivizes work, incentivizes laziness. When you start to outlaw different things that can be done and all that kind of stuff. So the issue is, if you're smart and you're diligent, then that doesn't guarantee success, but it tends towards it. And God tends to bless diligent, lawful labor to generate wealth. And if you want to improve your station in life, one of the things God promises increases your prosperity. Increases your prosperity is that there's a blessing on tithing. He says, test me in this. You see if your barns overflow. And so you go, is that health and wealth gospel? No, that's health and wealth law. But it also is, if God doesn't do it to you in this life, if he doesn't give you the blessing in this life, one, it's because it was for your good, and two, and for his glory, and two, he's going to reward you even more at the last judgment when he doesn't give you the blessing in this life. So if you do a good work in faith for the glory of God, and there's some blessing that's temporal that he promises, and then he doesn't give it in this life, he's going to give you a bigger one at the judgment. So
I'm going to tell you like the old folks used to tell you, I never seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread. Right? Like that I ain't seen it. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that one of the things that when you start having faith, and I think people they can exaggerate this and say, well, then where's their mansions at? But I've seen God take care of his people time and time and time again, in even captivity, right? If we know the story that even in captivity, God keeps his people and protects them and gives them judges and they don't deserve it, right? Like he keeps us. And primarily, the tithing thing, I've lived enough life to know that it was only God that worked this out through that kind of faithfulness in the saints' lives. So I believe that with all my heart. I love how you said it's not a prosperity gospel, it's prosperity law. That's a good one. Okay, what were you going to say?
Well, just so this whole question of should we use the government to try to make us so that we have more jobs, and to try to say, we want citizens to have more jobs, and the government should do things to protect those jobs for the citizens. It comes down to, again, who owns the jobs? The worker doesn't own the job. The government doesn't own the job. Who owns the job? The one who's buying the work. The employer owns the job. And so this is the politics of envy, trying to say we need to make people who are employers hire people that we prefer. And so I understand that it's a very popular,
good, David. That's good.
I understand that it's a popular message to say, make the rich people give us more money. I understand that it's popular. And at the same time, it is not what God's law says. And so the right of a person to spend their money as they see fit,
even across borders,
is given to them by God. And the ability to hire and fire. What is problematic is the reason that we have this like Marxist hiring regime is because we have the government involved in all sorts of employment policy, and HR departments were largely created to try to appease the bureaucracy. And the demon that is the HR department conjured the spirit of oppressing the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. And that's the anger, right? The anger is, why is it that white guys are being hurt by this? The reason they're being hurt by it is because of government intervention into the employment market.
By the way, that's the reason why any group that has any sort of valid argument in this has been hurt, period, economically. Why was the black family destroyed? Slavery didn't destroy us completely. It was the market of the government that came through. Black Wall Street rebuilt itself and got its name the second time after it rebuilt itself. What it couldn't survive was the government highways that came in and destroyed it, right? Every group, whatever you look at, that's been in one sense afflicted by the government doesn't come out well when you give the government all the authority. In a free market where the government is in control of things, everybody tends to do quite well.
Yes. There needs to be a destruction of the Department of Labor, and there needs to be a removal of the involvement of the government in employment in terms of doing anything other than adjudicating contracts, right? Like when you steal wages from a person, okay, that should be heavily punished, and multiple should be paid to the person that you stole the wages from. There's stuff like that, right? There's the keeping of contracts, but when you try to have the government come in and lay out things in terms of like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and you try to say you can't use religion as a basis for hiring you
or sex,
right? And you make all that stuff into this government intervention, and you start to have the government saying, hey, whether or not you're explicitly discriminating on the basis of any of these things, implicitly, if you haven't hired people inside of these categories, then we're going to say that you've effectively discriminated. That's what ends up happening. And so now you've got all these things where you could discriminate against everybody except for a white man, and then you make it so that you have like now there's like a choice to discriminate against a white man, right? And so there's this like attempt to shift things.
That's that pendulum swing that I was talking about earlier. And this is the same thing we talk about when it comes to, we were talking about the Jews and stuff like that too, and applying the law. When the reason that we end up getting that Civil Rights Act, and now in which we're rejecting in a lot of ways and pendulum swinging the other way, we got it because we weren't applying justice in the first place.
Right.
There was a lot of injustice happening that we weren't applying the law of God to. And instead of coming back and saying, well, let's just start applying the laws that's on the books, we say, let's make extra biblical law and make everybody, it would just flatten everything out instead of actually applying the law at the beginning. And so we just get these pendulum swings instead of coming back and say, well, wait a second. What if we just apply the biblical standards to everybody the same way?
Yes. And the other thing, if you don't have if you won't take the 10 commandments, you end up with the 10,000 commandments, right? That's the human beings just keep making the rules more and more to try to control. And the danger that you just pointed out, injustice, the reaction, as opposed to if you go, hey, here's an injustice over here, and you go, okay, instead of bringing it back to justice and seeing how that's going to restore things, you go, there's injustice over here. Let's do this injustice to fix it.
Right. That's right.
And so And what that causes is continuous pendulum swinging and destruction. And so the goal has to be to avoid the pendulum swing and to seek to come back to center, come back to what's appropriate. I'm not talking about, political centrism. I'm
No.
talking about the center being God's law, which is viewed as right-wing extremism, right? And so that's fine. But it's such a weird thing to have, theonomy and the idea of God's law as the standard being treated in a way as though it is insufficient, as though there's a need to do things to exercise extra controls in order to try to fix the imbalance. That fixing of the imbalance by trying to shift things back and go, well, actually, we just want discrimination in our favor. If we do that and we try to use civil power to do it, what we're doing is just functionally trying to use the same tactics in our favor. As opposed to trying to restore justice. So we need to remove the injustice and not institute new injustices.
So you don't. So then, this as far as H1b, because this is helpful, and I know you got to run. I've missed you for a whole hour, so just wrap this up really quickly. You don't feel like any company in America owes any American a job. I'm just trying to get you in more trouble.
Because a company, what is a company? A company is just the private property of persons. Individual persons. It's a legal person, and as a legal person, it's able to exercise the rights of the persons that own it, and so they're able to. It's a partnership of property and agreement of persons, and you have this legal person is able to act, right? And that's what a company is. And so when you impose rules on companies or try to treat companies as these things that can be oppressed and they don't have rights, you're just oppressing the owners. And what happens when you impose these rules on companies that are meant to limit what they can do, what you end up doing is you end up controlling them more and more, and you make private property into public property. And so what we need is Christian companies. What we need is Christian households, and realizing that companies are an extension of the household, and we need to be able to apply the whole law of God there. And this idea that the company is like a public good that can be controlled by the state and used for the well-being of the people, as opposed to used for the well-being of the owners. And the owners only get to advance their own profits by serving people through voluntary exchange, right? Unless you have a government-given monopoly. And so
that's right.
This idea that it's people serving people, and it's also the right of the owners of the property to choose what they spend their money on. You don't have a right to me hiring you. You don't have a right. I don't have a right to you hiring me. Right? There's no right to somebody else hiring you. The idea of a positive right where somebody has a duty to provide you with a thing is inherently socialistic, unless it's something that's very prescribed and limited by God. So, for example, there's a positive right to the administration of justice, which is something that the government taxes us for, and then it provides the service of the administration of justice. That's what it's duty bound to do. It's supposed to provide the defense of the state, and it's supposed to do these things by taxation, and it's extracting that coercive power, the resources to do it. But if you start to have it do these other things and control private property, you are using the state to extract rights, and to extract property, and to give them to people who are the favorites of the state.
And so also you got to think, Doug talks about the fact that, the world is built a particular way. If you blow a hole in my boat, you also blew a hole in yours. And so right now we're only thinking about the responsibilities and duties of the businesses and what they're supposed to be doing for Americans. But if you flip this around, if you believe that you hold to that, how long before you start saying Americans must buy America stuff first? That's your duty and that's your responsibility. But the truth is, the duty and responsibility you have is primarily to getting the best deal to keep more money in your pocket for your family so that you could be a blessing to the neighbors around you, so on and so forth, right? So to buy something more expensive just because it's American isn't not a responsibility and duty of yours. Your duty and responsibility is what is the most effective tool for me to use or value from me to use for my money so that I can have and allows me more revenue or generates revenue for me or creates savings for me that I can use for my family to be a blessing in the environment, my church, and everywhere else that I'm in too. It's not long before you start taking that same application of businesses and putting it onto the buyer.
Yes.
Right. That's
what the business is. They're just a buyer, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. All right, David. So we didn't even get into the idea of outside sources investing in American society. So, because that's another, like, you got these companies coming in and giving billions of dollars to certain entities inside of America to build, I guess if it's a company who's getting money, that's great, but it's been handled by presidents. It's really weird. I want to talk more about that because this is what I think people are missing about the conversation about civic covenanting, Christian nationalism. What does this look like as we start applying it? And how do we as Christians, how do we speak into these conversations that are happening and say we have a better answer and how to generate human flourishing around holding to God's standards, right? I want to have that conversation. And that's what I want to do with you for the rest of the year, if we possibly can. So where do you want to go 2025 with Civic Covenanting? I don't remember where exactly we left off at, but I want to talk about these main things and bring them back to a principle that we have, just like you did with the first table of the law, just like you did with the duties and responsibilities of the government versus the business and the company, the individual, buy, sell, and trade. That was super helpful. I'm sure people are going to send you a lot of hate mail at davidreece.com or
you can reach, if anybody wants to reach out to me, they can reach out to me at david@reecefund.com. And if you want to find out more things that you can be angry about me for teaching, you can check me out at puritan.church and then find other reasons to dislike me.
So 2025, quickly, what are some things that you think that we need to really anchor inside of evangelicals and Christians in 2025 and that you want to work through with Civic Covenanting?
Well, I think that if we're talking about civic covenanting proper in terms of like the actual,
all we're ever talking about.
Yes. Well, if we're talking about that in the more narrow way, you think about this idea of how do you actually get to have any sort of effect? And I think that the process of building, we spent a lot of time talking about building up the individual and the household. And I think the idea of organizing and accomplishing things, people always want to say, well, that's all sounds great, but it's not practical. And how are you ever going to get there? And sure, maybe that's a great ideal, but what are you going to do besides that? And I think that it's important to address the practicality question, but I think it also is important to address the issues that people are thinking through. Like you've said, what is the standard? What's the ideal? But it's like, okay, so we have this view that we should have, the government doing all the things we just talked about, and not doing a bunch of stuff it's supposed to do. But how are we going to fix that? What's going to happen there? And I think that the question of the practicality of making that happen is something that everybody's kind of wondering about. And the reality is we have to acknowledge the fact that on a large scale, your capacity as an individual to affect the centralized power of the federal government is extremely limited unless you are very highly resourced. And so the idea of
Elon Musk, right?
The idea of high resourcing or local focus and being strategic about what are you pursuing, high resourcing, or are you pursuing a local focus? And how do you stair step those things? So I think that's a big part of what has to happen. But frankly, to exercise that kind of power, we have to be extremely wise and we have to be extremely well resourced.
I don't disagree with anything you just said. I just also want to encourage people to remember historically, we had 12 guys.
Right.
We had 12. And now we have places all over the world with that gospel.
Yes.
We forget the power that we have in being able to communicate well enough and the work of the Holy Spirit in people's hearts that transforms the way people think and the way that they live. We will not solve all the world's problem in our lifetime. That's not the way God made it. But there is something that we're supposed to do in faithfulness that moves the ball further down the court. And the place that starts isn't right in everything local. Our biggest problem, the way you broke this down for individuals, who's buying the jobs, it was everything based off of the four operating spheres: self-government, church government, a civil government, right? What's the last one?
Household.
Household. Thank you. Household. I always mix the self and the house together. Sometimes I always forget the fourth, but that's very important. And so those have real massive impacts in society. And as you operate that way, you can't help but have impact locally, civilly, church, household.